Now we come to Reims, and this is again another one of those colored depictions, again giving you that sense of what would have looked like painted. Of course, again, this is just light projected onto the surface, but you get the idea. Now, the church itself is named for Saint Remy, who baptized the last of the Merovingian pagan kings. And we see the coronation of the French monarchy done here. Now, in 1211, the older cathedral is destroyed by, wait for it, I know it's going to be shocking for you, but fire. Yet again. The archbishop, again, rebuilds. We see riots occurring here that will disrupt the building in 1230. The bishop gets the support of the king, then building resumes around 1241. And it's not surprising that you see issues like that when you have buildings that take between 75, frequently between 50 and 100 years to build. You're going to have a lot of interruption. And also keep in mind the person who starts it probably won't live to see its completion. Now, this structure is 123 feet tall, so it's actually smaller than Amiens. And it's on the cusp of the late Gothic, something called the Rayonnant style. And Rayonnant is Rayonnant. It's also known as the flamboyant style. I'll get into it a little bit more in a minute. But it's characterized by a shift from great scale towards a greater concern for two-dimensional surfaces, usually a repetitive painted pattern on two-dimensional surfaces, and a repetition of decorative motifs. We also see a change in the tracery where it becomes more flame-like and thinner, much, much finer work. Now, when we go inside, we see again the 3-part elevation, the 4-part rib vaults that we've been seeing in the past. But you'll notice it doesn't seem to have the incredible height that we've seen before. In fact, the nave almost seems a little wider, even though it isn't. Simply a little shorter. So they're changing their focus. Again, they've gotten to the point where the stone can barely hold up what they're building. So we have to do something different. Now, the interesting thing here at Reims is going to be, before we get there, here's a little bit more about the Rayonnant style. This idea of basically creating walls of glass, of the tracery, two-dimensional forms being repetitively painted and three-dimensional forms being covered in sculpture. But the interesting thing at Reims is really 2 statues, actually 4 statues in 2 groups. Here we see the Annunciation and Visitation. The Annunciation is when Gabriel appears to the Virgin Mary and tells her that she's about to give birth to the Son of God. The Visitation is when Mary goes to visit her sister Elizabeth and basically tells her of this miracle. Now, I want to call your attention to the background before we talk about the statue, because you can actually see some of the painted pattern that was common to these cathedrals painted in parts of this sort of zigzag chevron pattern that we see on some of the columns. We also see that the faces clearly were painted and the angel's wings clearly were painted. Actually, most of this will have been painted, but oftentimes the stone will need to be replaced. With many of these cathedrals, you have volunteer construction workers, or sometimes paid construction workers, who work continuously for the cathedral, moving around it in anywhere from a 10 to 20 year cycle, basically replacing pieces of statuary or stones that have become so damaged that they need to be permanently replaced. So it's not unusual. Now, what we're seeing is a stylistic development of Gothic naturalism, a movement of sacred and biblical history. And what we're seeing, first of all, all 4 of the statues seem to be separated from the columns that they began as part of. So originally these would have been elongated and looked like part of the column, but here they're definitely simply standing in front of the column. Now, look at these, and we have the Visitation and the Annunciation. This is the Annunciation over here, and the Visitation on this side. And just look at for a moment and decide which one is later. Which one is truly innovative here? Well, most people would figure that the Visitation would actually be later. It looks more detailed, but in fact the Annunciation is later. And let's talk about that. So when we look at the Archangel Gabriel, you see that Gabriel is created in this sort of Renaissance style. We see an exaggerated S-curve to his body. And we see a sense of movement. Gabriel, being an angel, is sort of asexual or agendered, is ambiguous, doesn't have a gender. And the reason for that is angels weren't believed to have genders, so you can't have a male or a female angel. And very unusual looking. You've got this very small head. Originally there were 2 wings, now there's only 1. And very fine detail. In fact, the sculptor is probably looking at a human wearing this clothing. And the small head is in part because the head is actually cocked towards us, as if the angel's sort of looking downward. Mary's where things get more interesting. This looks like a lifelike Mary. You can imagine Mary's body looking like this in very simple robes, which she would have been wearing. The other interesting thing is Mary has breasts, and that's important because suddenly Mary is becoming human again. Mary is being seen as not only the mother of God, but a female in and of her own right, and that's a major shift for the church. Whereas on the other side, our figures have detailed faces, but then they're wearing those 20 yards of wet silk that we've been getting used to seeing. Neither Mary nor Elizabeth have anything about them that would tell us that they're female other than feminine features in their face and the way they're wearing their clothing. Whereas here, Mary definitely looks the part, looks realistic. The angel there has a tilted head, puffy eyes, and this eccentric grin with this somewhat androgynous figure. So what we have is the Annunciation is done afterwards based on looking at people, looking at models, as opposed to the Visitation, which is based on looking at other sculptures or looking at not models but conventions, looking at rules. So we see the difference. And while the angel looks a little unusual, Mary, if you focus on Mary in both of them, and by the way, this is Mary here, obviously, but this is Mary in this depiction, what we get is a much more realistic Mary in the Annunciation.